Hi, I'm Christine Emba, opinion columnist for The Washington Post. A major row between Harvard philosopher Cornel West and best-selling author Ta-Nehisi Coates has triggered new debate about the responsibilities of the Black intellectual and the role of social media in public discourse. Here to talk with me about it are Wes Lowery, national reporter for The Washington Post, and Karen Attia, global opinions editor. First, a little background for our viewers. On Sunday, Cornel West published an article in The Guardian calling Coates the neoliberal face of the Black freedom struggle. The piece accused Coates of fetishizing white supremacy while ignoring Wall Street greed, elite indifference to poverty, and U.S. imperial crimes, especially under Barack Obama. Coates pushed back, posting links to his past work. But eventually, at the end of it all, Coates chose to leave Twitter altogether. So, let's get right into it, actually. What is the role of the Black public intellectual? Just a small question. We'll start with you, Wes.
Well, I think historically, right? Before you can talk about the Black public intellectual, you have to talk about the idea of a public intellectual in general, right? And I try to very simply think about a public intellectual as someone whose job it is to think about things in public, right? To be sometimes a step removed or a step back from the news cycle and to analyze our current events in front of us and our current political environment and social environment in front of us and link those things to our history and to the history of our culture and our society and try to help explain and create a roadmap. Now, specifically the Black public intellectual has very often had to serve in some ways as a racial conscience of the United States of America, and that there are people who are willing to talk about racial truths that oftentimes the majority of the population is unwilling or unhappy to accept, right? You think about people like Frederick Douglass or James Baldwin. More recently, people like Cornel West or Michael Eric Dyson and now Ta-Nehisi, right? Folks who exist in a space to speak hard truths in public about how the things we see happening every day are linked to a history of race-based policies in the United States of America, right?
So, the history and the United States, those are two interesting points. And Karen, I think we've just talked about this pretty recently. There's a historical context, but there's also a global context. Yeah. You know, we're not just Black in America, we're Black in the world. And is there a different role that the intellectual plays there?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially now there is that long history also, Booker T. Washington, of course, but then we also have like Frantz Fanon. You also have Aimé Césaire, who have been the carriers of, like, say, negritude from the Caribbean to Africa. And then also the Black public intellectual, it's kind of interesting because you also think about it as intellectual, so academia, but then also it's about activists. Sometimes it's also about, our Black public intellectuals, like the leaders of African independence movement. We look to Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, on his thoughts of post-colonialism, for instance, and Africans inserting themselves in the world. I think the Black intellectual, touching on what Wesley said, and this idea of occupying space, I think the complication when it comes to Black public intellectuals is the roles that they have to play in that space. So it's, on one end, some would argue it's speaking about Black people, but to whom, right? Speaking about Black people to a white audience? Or is it speaking for Black people who gets to decide, who becomes a Black public intellectual? So I think, when it comes to Ta-Nehisi Coates, there can be pushback because it's like there's so few of us, right? And the ones who are exalted and do kind of have that throne, it's like, well, who put them there and why and what does that serve? And this is the same with Cornel West too, right? So I think it does lead to questions about power and privilege and about this limited space sometimes for Black people. And I think that's even shrinking sometimes, even in the post-Obama era. I don't know. Leslie might have a different thought.
There's kind of a before and after almost too. We have sort of the pre-Obama era where we're talking a lot about kind of intellectual concerns about, Black life in the United States and our history of slavery. And that's something that Coates has talked a lot about. But then, there's talking about the rest of the world. But the Obama era, I think, has been kind of a turning point in Black people in public life and kind of the conversations that we're having. Do you think that has kind of changed the conversation and maybe how this whole Twitter spat?
Well, I think that, so I think there's a few things, right? I think that contextually, we for a very long time have allowed, and we being we, the entire American culture, not we Black Americans, have allowed for very few Black public intellectuals, few people who are placed in positions to speak on the behalf of Black America. Very often that's a slot for one or two people, and you see that carrying itself all the way into the beginning of the Obama administration. What became very different, and Cornel West, by the way, would unquestionably be one of those people who throughout the 90s and early 2000s was among the few who got to speak on behalf of Black America. Now again, that's not something Black America chose or elected, but rather that was something people who are in power, who allow, who create the kind of table of public discourse, very often would allow a slot or two for a Black American, right? What was different about the Obama years, and Ta-Nehisi actually writes about this in We Were 8 Years in Power, was how it in many ways created a new age of Black writer, of Black journalist, of Black intellectual. You saw a now desire among the majority of people to be able to understand and also to speak at level about race and its interaction with the presidency, and so therefore that required a broadening of that envelope. And so you started to see was an entire generation of people who had already been working in academic spaces, working in journalism spaces, who now gained prominence and platform they didn't have previously. What that does, Ta-Nehisi being among the chief of those people, right? What that does is that creates one, competition within that set of folks, and that is both at times friendly and unfriendly. It creates power and struggles and the feeling sometimes of a threatening nature among those who were already exalted intellectuals versus now this new rising crop of people. Who are you? Who let you into this conversation? And it also, because Black people are complex and complicated, and we believe a lot of different things.
What?
It creates a space now where it's not, well, this is what the one Black guy we let on TV says about this. Now all of a sudden you have a diversity of opinion even within the diaspora, and that allows now a different level of debate, right? And so while we very often want to thrust someone up as I believe everything they believe or I believe nothing that they believe, the reality is most of us probably agree.
So Karen,
Yeah, no, I think, in going back to the question about internationalism and about diaspora, I mean, I think that is when people say that Cornel West is an internationalist, and again, the criticisms of Ta-Nehisi Coates, but now we have almost this expectation that a Black public intellectual shouldn't only speak for Black people in America, but should speak for Black people everywhere. So Black people in Europe, Black people in Africa and Libya, to speak out against the militarization of Africa, to speak out against economic policies that disenfranchise Black people around the world. Again, whether or not that's fair or not, I don't think that's fair, but again, it's this question of where's that. Cornel West is a part of that tradition, or people consider himself a part of that tradition. Ta-Nehisi Coates' lane is not so much that, but I think there is this sort of heightened interconnectivity, which is good for activism. I think good for putting the American experience in race in context with the struggles of people of color around the world. I think that is good. What that leads to is, I think, very interesting and very valuable conversations between countries and cultures and our histories and how they interact and how they don't. But I think it can lead to this unfair burden of the one powerful, magical, person of color in the most powerful country in the world, some would argue, speaking for everybody, and that's just not fair.
So I have a Twitter comment, actually.
Hi, Twitter.
Hello, Twitter.
Twitter could be all right.
On Twitter, Hunter Christopher says, the role of the Black public intellectual is the same as it's always been, holding the moral and intellectual line against a structurally racist society. So actually, Karen, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Okay.
Karen, again, Global Opinions editor. You mentioned a little earlier in our conversation the responsibilities that come with being a public face or a Black public face. And there are both sort of written and unwritten rules. And one of them is, holding this line, as Hunter says. But when you're holding the line, that kind of implies that you all agree on the same line, like you all have the same beliefs, or you all need to kind of support the same process. Is that true or not? It seems kind of difficult and problematic to say that all Black people have to believe the same thing and hold the same line, or we have to agree in public. But that seemed to have been part of a conversation this week.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting to see how the conversation, there's some aspects of the response to this debate that has been why are we airing our dirty laundry in public? Dr. West, couldn't you just taken Coates aside and just into a room and expressed your disagreements, with him instead of going to the Guardian and doing that. I mean, I think it's the Black public intellectuals like role and this sort of, it's hard because you're trying to speak to two different audiences at once. You're trying to sort of help and uplift and speak to Black people, but then also speaking for Black people. Sometimes those can have contradictory elements, and people will try to assign you as being one or the other or both. I mean, there are plenty of people who will, ask someone like Coates, it's like, white people love your work. Like, why is that? There must be something wrong, with, or Black people will say, Coates doesn't say anything that I don't already know. I live out racism every day, but he still fulfills a very important role in explaining and putting our issues up on this national, international platform. So it's really hard to draw absolute lines, especially as the Black needs and experience and our political realities in some ways have stayed the same, but in some ways are the tools that we need and the people that we need to help fight this fight is evolving or changing.
And so another comment, actually, this time from Facebook, Keisha Smith says, we need less talking amongst the intellectuals and more actions. They need to be a bit more active in the formation of laws and policies. So Wes, as a national reporter, I think you've been kind of in the trenches thinking about these questions. How is that role playing itself out? Is that disagreement still visible? What do you see?
I think there is disagreement there, and I think that many people go about these jobs different ways. I think even within this entire conversation is framed around kind of Dr. Cornel West and Ta-Nehisi, right? And these are two people who, while both could be described as public intellectuals or Black public intellectuals, are actually do different jobs, right? Like Cornel West is an academic, and he would say a prophetic preacher.
Prophetic voice,
yes, right?
Yeah.
Ta-Nehisi Coates is a essayist and a journalist, right? And, veering towards historian, right? But and those are two actual different jobs. You do them differently, right? It requires different things. You have other folks who are writers along those lines who might also describe themselves as activists. Cornel probably would do that. Well, Ta-Nehisi probably would not necessarily, right? And so there are different roles depending on what exactly their jobs are. And I think that one of the reasons we're having this, disagreement among Black public intellectuals and disagreement among Black people is as old as Black people and Black public intellectuals have existed, right?
People generally, right?
Right, and these fights have played out in public forever. One thing I think is different about this moment is we have a different level of access to our public intellectuals than we did previously. Even 20 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago, we would have no idea what James Baldwin was up to on Tuesday night. We would just wait until something got published, and then we would know how he feels about a thing, right? In this moment, there's an expectation of immediacy. We see this as journalists. We see this, friends who are activists see this. Friends who are public intellectual types see this, where we want our public figures to know and do and be all things at all times. Why have you not commented on this thing that just happened right now? And I think that can become difficult because it requires a level of willingness to engage in that level of accessibility. There are some Tuesday nights where I bet most people who write words for a living would like to be on a date or in bed sleeping.
Really? That's a...
in fact, folks, I would know nothing about any of these things because I'm here all the time. But this idea that even folks who think out loud and think in public are not necessarily accessible at all times to do those things. But beyond that, in order to do these jobs well, you have to know what you are talking about, right? There are a lot of issues. I report on issues of race within the states for the Post and do so relatively prominently. There are a lot of issues that I do not feel comfortable weighing in on or veering into because I genuinely have no idea any of the basics. I know what my initial perception might be, but I can't actually at a high level debate or analyze this, while there are other lanes and spaces where I feel extremely comfortable kind of quickly jumping in.
And that brings us actually to the next part of our conversation. And also I'm just thinking back and thinking aloud on Twitter. Earlier this week, I was kind of in a joke debate about this. Everyone's sort of like, well, why aren't Black thinkers weighing in on X, Y, and Z question? Like, why hasn't Beyonce commented on the neoliberal struggle?
Oh, man.
Why hasn't Issa Rae said anything about post-colonialism? It's like, people have lives to lead, like they have other things. But That is a thing about Twitter and sort of the call out culture on Twitter. People are expected to have a stance, and often I think there's a lot of sort of performance happening. So even in the title of Cornel West's piece there, the face of the neoliberal struggle, there are these words being thrown around like neoliberalism or even like white supremacy, and like they're not always very clearly defined, but they're often used by people to signal either that they know what they're talking about or that they're part of a certain conversation. Is that a good thing? And I mean, I think when I think about writing myself, often like defining the terms and staying in my lane when I need to and like acknowledging what I don't know is important.
Yeah.
Has that changed the way that conversation is happening among intellectuals, among writers, among the quality of thought and product that we're putting out? Karen, as global editor, what do you think?
I mean, like for me, like my lane as far as like coverage and as far as the things that I write about have tended to be about Black people abroad, so about Africa and one thing that is amazing, and I think in this moment, and that Twitter and Facebook and other forms of social media lends itself to, is that Black people around the world can like talk back. Like, if there's a piece that stereotypically paints Africans as spear-wielding, monkey brain eating, natives, pygmies, like Kenyans can be like, what the hell? Like this is actually, and that actually really happened. Like Kenyans clapped back at news coverage and unfair framing and narratives and all of that. I think what happens though, it's weird because even though there are these spaces for people to talk back, and I think Twitter is a great platform in a lot of ways for people of color because we have for so long been left out of elite intellectual spaces, media spaces, Hollywood, and so some of these spaces have created opportunities for us to express ourselves in public. But at the same time, it comes with costs. It's like you're thinking you want to write something, right? And then you're already thinking like, oh man, am I going to be dragged? Like, or you have that in the back of my mind, like I'm just not ready to be curb stomped on Twitter right now. And from sometimes your Black community, but then also like, I mean, for writers of color, it's not always safe to write about race. Like, I mean, we can talk for hours about, I'm sure, the hate mail that us three have gotten when we touch on issues of race, white supremacy, and we're just trying to spout facts about what it's like to live as a Black person in this society, and the racism and the threats that are thrown our way sometimes are incredible. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know, there's this, I think it's healthy to have these debates. I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to having a diversity of thought, like some of these spaces that were still so long closed off to Black people, people of color, to have more of them in the public eye. Like, we should have plenty of Ta-Nehisi Coates. We should have plenty of Lupita Nyong'os. We should have plenty of Naomi Campbell's or Spike Lee's, whatever. And so it puts such an unfair burden on the ones who do make it, the talented 10th, right?
So I'm going to jump back in because we have another Facebook comment, and then I'm going to throw this one to you, actually, Wes. It's more of a policy question. So first on Facebook, Harold Anderson says, Cornel West is a self-serving clown who, like Trump, can't brook the notion that anyone other than himself might be the center of attention. You don't have to respond to that one. But also on Facebook, Tina Hayes says, I don't normally agree with West, but I think he has a point when he says Coates et al. Have fetishized our grievances in this country. That being said, West and many on the far left have taken to demonizing people like Coates and Obama as neoliberals. They have no tolerance for any disagreement or dissension from their viewpoint. And West is a national reporter and kind of focusing on those. I wonder if, first of all, you have any thoughts on this question of neoliberalism, just like what we mean when we say that. And this sort of fetishizing of white supremacy or the focus on certain questions and not others.
Sure. Well, I mean, and I think that what we see very often is we see writers or thinkers who are driving a specific narrative, no matter what that narrative is. And over time, their writing and their public speaking builds an argument and a theory of existence, right? And often they continue to do writing that would build towards that theory. What I think about this kind of current debate, though, and one of the things I found lacking without weighing in on the specifics of this kind of clash between Cornel West and Ta-Nehisi, though, is that one of the things I found lacking about the critique was a lack of specificity in some spaces, right? And so if you think about this, were this a high school debate team, were we writing warring essays with each other, right? We would very often, we would be required to define terms. We would be required to restate here are the arguments that Dr. West just made, and here are the 4 reasons why I think they are wrong, right? One of the things about kind of the immediacy of feedback, and we see this in the social media world, but we also see it in a world in which we can fire off an op-ed in 32 minutes and get it published, right? Is that very often there's not necessarily the kind of the rigorous ringer through which our arguments are interrogated. I can come up with some argument in my head right now and publish it to however many followers I have.
The hottest take.
Immediately, right? Without much intellectual exercise. And so one of the things that I found disappointing about West's kind of critique of Ta-Nehisi, because this really was in some ways kind of a one-way argument, right?
Yeah.
Was that I didn't know that it met my kind of level of intellectual rigor, no matter what I believe about the kind of underlying points of debate here, right? And I think that that's one thing that kind of in this moment with this immediacy, with this expectation of everyone supposedly having to be all things to all people at all times, is that it takes away our ability to kind of, one, deliberately stop and think and consider, but two, sometimes it takes away the willingness of folks to argue and debate these things in good faith, right? And so if an argument is that an author has not addressed 3 issues, but that author the next day can provide you with links to those 3 things they've written about, to me, that is evidence of a lack of academic and intellectual rigor or a lack of good faith in the initial kind of critique, right?
Yeah.
You know, I get this all the time. Why won't you write about X, Y, and Z? And it's like, oh, here's a link to that thing I wrote about last week, right?
That takes a lot of work. Like, it's sometimes there's this expectation that just because you're black, you can read and write just like automatically we understand this
You
experience.
know all the things already.
Like
Yeah.
it takes reading of history, it takes work, it takes us, again, like Wesley said, like taking that time to really intellectually build that argument. And so I think if anything, like I kind of find this debate refreshing because it made me kind of think that like the responses to this, I hope, should be, again, like meeting a certain intellectual rigor that I think people should really take time to think. Because for me, regardless again of what you think of, I think the original Guardian piece could have been a lot better, obviously. But I'm like, it has made me really kind of step back and really think about some of these points. That,
what do I need to know? Like what?
Yeah,
what
is
should I be
neoliberalism?
thinking?
Yeah, what is
What is neoliberalism?
right, what does it mean? Again, even just thinking of the post-Obama era or the Trump era, whatever you want to call it, even what does post-Obama era mean? Should we really say that? Like, I think it's good that we're thinking and talking about things, but again, I think the pressure is so much higher.
So we're out of time right now. So I'll have to close this out, and we can think about neoliberalism and
In a tweet.
refocusing our priorities in the next hot take on Twitter. But again, thank you, Wes Lowry, again, national reporter for the Washington Post, and Karen Attia, global opinions editor. I'm Christine Emba, opinions columnist, and keep your comments coming on Facebook and Twitter. It'll give me something to write about. Have a good afternoon. Happy holidays.